Jonathan Griffiths here, Chancellor of Heritage College and Seminary, with Dr. Michael Haykin, our Professor of Church History and longtime faculty member here at the Theological Seminary. And we're together today to talk about theological education in Canada and the United States, similarities and differences, and why heritage matters. Thrilled to be able to spend some time together in conversation.
Great to be here.
Michael, I wanted to open up really by asking why it is you have felt it a valuable investment to spend your time teaching here at Heritage all these years. You've had a long involvement in Heritage, and I know you love this school. Why do you think Heritage matters so much?
Yeah, I think when I first started teaching, it was prior to the merger with London College, London Baptist Seminary, and it was at that point Central Baptist Seminary in Toronto. And that merger took place in the 1990s. And by the end of the 1990s, I had moved into Christian publishing, and then accepted a call to teach full-time at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. We didn't move to the States. There were family reasons, but also there was a strong conviction that the Canadian scene needed theologians, historians, biblical scholars. The United States, given its much larger population, as well as its larger constituency of evangelicals, has more than its share of scholars and schools. Whereas Canada, it's limited, very limited. And so one of the things that that drove me when I did accept a position at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which has been a tremendous experience, was nonetheless to stay in Canada, that I might still be of value and involvement in our theological education here. Since around 2016, it's become very evident to me that Canadian evangelicalism and American evangelicalism certainly go back to a common root. We share a common heritage in the British evangelical revivals of the 18th century. But the political scenario, the cultural scenario, the ethos of Canada and the United States as they developed in the course of the 19th century, early 20th centuries, has put us on different trajectories. And the fact that in the early years of Canada, as British North America, the Anglican Church was a very dominant power, and its links to its mother church in Britain had an influence over other denominational bodies. So as evangelicalism developed in Canada, it had a very, very clearly, very clear link and unity with British evangelicalism and not so much American evangelicalism. And those political realities have certainly become very evident in the last probably 8 to 10 years, that Canadian evangelicals think about church and state, church and culture somewhat differently. And thus for me, training leaders in Canada, both men and women, for the life of the local church and parachurch organizations, necessitates Canadians being involved in that education, but also necessitates doing that at theological education here rather than the United States. If you go back into the early 19th century, you find that Canadian evangelicals have always been attracted to American schools. And the danger always was, especially in those days with men, they would go down, marry an American woman, and they'd end up in the States. More opportunities, etc. Or if they did come back, their training did not exactly prepare them for the Canadian cultural context. And if that was true in the 19th century, it's certainly as true, if not more true today, that the Canadian theological context, the Canadian cultural context is significantly different from that of America. And if we are to train leaders for this context, they need to be done here in the context of the Canadian milieu.
I mean, I wholeheartedly believe that, and I can only agree with you. But I'd love to drill down on a couple of things you've just mentioned and alluded to. In terms of cultural differences and theological differences and ecclesiastical differences, we're aware of some of the challenges in the American church just now. What are some of the particular challenges we are facing in the Canadian church that we need to be alive to and we need to be preparing students to speak into and to minister into?
Well, I think for the last probably 50 to 60 years, maybe going back to the 1960s, Canadian evangelicals have been a marginal voice.
Right.
Unlike the American context, where if you look at presidential candidates, they woo the evangelical vote. How large that vote is obviously varies. It probably could be anywhere between 20 to 25% of people who would describe themselves as evangelicals, even if they don't really know what that term means. In the Canadian scene, it's completely different. Probably the largest concentration of evangelicals in Canada would be maybe Alberta, maybe southwestern Ontario, the kind of Bible Belt around London historically. Quebec is a major mission field.
Right.
1 or 2% evangelicals.
Something like that.
Compared to the larger population of 8 or 9 million. Ontario, again, it depends on what you mean by an evangelical. Depends on how you define that word. The Angus Reid poll of the late 1990s defined it fairly broadly and came up with double digits of evangelicals across Canada. That was challenged by people like John Stackhouse, and I think rightly so. I think probably in Ontario you're looking at less than single digits. And thus we are a marginal voice. This has not always been the case. The 19th century can be described as the evangelical century in Canadian history, but that is not the case now. And therefore our training has to be one in which Christian leaders realize that they do have a minimal influence in the larger scene. There is a overt and times, well, I think implicit, but at times overt rejection of the evangelical message that pervades the Canadian scene. And I think we have to train leaders, be prepared to stand against the flow, to be prepared to be dissenters, and to be prepared to be marginalized. The kind of triumphalism, which I think does mark certain sectors of American evangelicalism, really has little place here in the Canadian scene. We can hope for better, and I think we should hope for better and labor for better. But I think the reality is that we need to deal with, and that leaders need to come to grips with, is that we are a marginal voice. And what does it mean to be a marginal voice? And I think that New Testament is enormously helpful here. If you look at 1 Peter,
yes.
These are books written where the people of God are recognized as a pilgrim people. This is not their home. And therefore, how do we bear witness in the public square, in that sort of context?
I don't know if you would think this is accurate. My feeling and my impression has been that we have a dearth of evangelical thought leadership, intellectual leadership in Canada, that we haven't fostered this as we might have. And often when we look for theological guidance on issues, if we look for authors even to read, we look to evangelical thinkers, writers, leaders in other places so often. Now, you stand out, Michael, as someone who is a Canadian evangelical intellectual and a thought leader, but there aren't many such people in this country. Now, that you may feel that that's not accurate. That's been my impression. And one of the things on my heart is to think through and pray through how we might foster a new evangelical cadre of thought leaders in this country, who can give leadership to the church in thinking through big issues.
No, I think you are right. I think the challenge has been to prevent Canadian evangelical intellectuals, Canadian leaders in intellectual reflection, from moving down to the United States or moving to the UK. Again, the pattern in the 19th century was for us to look to Britain for our leadership. So Jarvis Street Baptist Church, for example, in Toronto, which was kind of the premier Baptist church in the Dominion of Canada in the 19th century, always had somebody pretty well brought over from the UK. And then when they switched, they moved to start getting Americans. That really kind of typifies a pattern that we have either looked to the UK or we've looked to the United States. And so what are people reading here as evangelicals? They're reading R.C. Sproul or John MacArthur or whomever. They're all Americans writing from an American vantage point. And that cultural idiom in which they're writing does shape their concerns, their emphases, etc., which are not our concerns and emphases necessarily.
Right.
And so I laud the idea of trying to develop Canadian leadership that is intellectually rigorous, grounded in the Canadian context, and homegrown, as it were. But we have not done a good job at this.
How do we begin to correct that? How do we foster it?
I think in one sense it has to come at the grassroots. I think churches have to realize that the situation is one in which they need to invest. There are significant individuals in our world that have finances, and often those finances are directed towards parachurch organizations and missions.
Yeah.
They need to see theological education as a major priority. In the next 30 years, we're going to see a significant number of pastors retiring. How are we going to replace them? And the argument that this can be all done in the local church is, in my mind, completely fallacious. Certain things can be taught in the local church. Yeah, certainly preaching, honing one's preaching skills, counseling, pastoral ministry. But things like exegesis, the languages, Old New Testament scholarship, church history, systematics, these have to be taught by individuals who have given their lives to understanding these worlds, etc. And that's the context in which theological education has to be done. And I think local churches have to get a vision that they desperately need the academy.
And we don't always see that in the local church, but we do need the academy. Seminaries are in crisis across North America. You and I were speaking earlier about Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and the series of events there which have led to the decision to move from Chicago and to relocate to British Columbia. Could you give us a little insight on the nature of the challenges facing seminaries at the present time and how it is perhaps we can enable seminaries to thrive for the future? Because we've just said we need them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of it obviously is financial. Seminaries have physical locales and buildings have to be maintained and upkept. Some of it's got to do with the technological developments in our culture, the development of the internet, the possibility of online education. And so online education can be done from anywhere, really. So why move to a locale where there is a physical building and when I can do it from my living room or my home office? I thank God for online education. It certainly was very helpful during the pandemic that we've recently gone through.
It was.
But having said that, there is something about personal presence in a classroom setting where, I've taught a significant amount online, and it gets the job done, but there's something lacking.
Right.
What's lacking is at break, you don't have that chit-chat that goes on between students or between professor and students. Right. And so there is something to be said for the physical presence in a campus setting. But definitely, that obviously then there is finances to upkeep that. So one of our challenges is financial. The other is technological. And then there is this subtle movement among local churches, which almost in my mind, because of my historical bent, sounds a bit like landmarkism, which was the idea that there is no such thing as the universal church. There are local churches, and the local church is the be-all and the end-all. And I hear a time and time again this idea that the most important thing in the world of God's work in the world is the local church. But then what do we do? What are we thinking then about these large numbers of parachurch organizations Do they fit within God's purposes and parameters? And one of those parachurch organizations are seminaries.
Yeah.
And I think seminaries are absolutely needed. They're not a luxury item, and they're not an optional item. And so there is this argument that it is biblical to be focused completely on the local church. But I think there is a recognition, you find it in Ephesians and Colossians, there is such a thing as the universal church. And that is the body of churches, not only the universal church throughout space and time, but the body of churches in association, working together in various things that they cannot do by themselves, and one of them is education.
Right.
So I think we have a number of challenges. We have financial, we have technological, but we also have this growing idea, which is biblicist in a bad sense,
Yes.
that the only thing that really matters is the local church. And to focus on anything else is really taking away resources and energy from the local church. But I think the book of Colossians and Ephesians, where the word church is broader, I think points us to the reality that we need to work together as local churches.
That's very helpful theologically, because I see it practically, but to recognize that there is a theological aspect to this is immensely helpful. I know you believe in heritage. You've invested so much of yourself in heritage over the years. What do you see as heritage's place and role in Canadian evangelicalism for this next season?
Well, I think heritage is unique in a number of ways. It's unique in the way evangelicalism has developed in Ontario. So we have a commitment to complementarianism,
Right.
which we would argue is a biblical understanding of the calling to leadership in the local church. There is no other school really of our size and et cetera that has that vision in Ontario. The history of heritage is being able to cross a number of denominational boundaries. We have, at the same time as the commitment to a distinct ecclesiological vision, we also have a Catholicity. And I think Catholicity is very significant for us in the Canadian context because there are not tons of evangelicals, and we need to work together.
We do.
Those who share a like vision regarding Scripture, etc., need to work together despite the fact that we might find ourselves in different denominational bodies.
Right.
The United States has maybe greater luxury to put up denominational barriers. We do not. And heritage then has both the strength of a distinct ecclesiological convictions, but also this Catholicity where we have been able to serve a variety of denominational bodies in the context of Ontario and Canada.
For a student who is contemplating seminary, is looking at options, a Canadian student who is looking at heritage as one possibility and a number of institutions south of the border as other possibilities, would you have some final words of wisdom?
There's a degree of conflict of interest here.
I'm aware.
Yeah, because I love Southern.
Yeah.
And Southern is an incredible school.
Indeed.
In terms of all of its programs. But I would strongly encourage, given a number of developments in recent days, politically, socially, culturally, but also financially. So if a student goes south of the border, they're going to be paying international rates.
Yes.
And with the relationship of the Canadian dollar to the American dollar, that's a significant amount of money that you'll be spending out of pocket. Where you could get a very, very fine theological education here at home at Heritage. Again, also, Heritage is Canadian.
Yeah.
We're training for the Canadian context. It's not surprising that American schools are training for an American context. We should expect no less. But the ecclesial and social cultural differences that have become really marked in the past 10 or 12 years, I think also warrant us to encourage Canadian students to stay home and to do ministry and do their theological education at a place like Heritage.
That's great encouragement. Michael, it's great to chat.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning into today's podcast episode. Something new is coming. Real conversations, timely questions and gospel-centered thinking. Watch for our new podcast, Landing Fall 2025. Stay tuned.